Okay, we're on. Thank you very much for joining us in this very interesting, or what I hope will be a very interesting conversation with Martin Wolf, Associate Editor and Chief Economics Commentator from the Financial Times, London. Welcome to this event, Martin. Thank you very much for joining us. And as I said, prior to this, we'll dispense with the formalities and we'll go straight into setting the context for today's discussion, which is surrounding the question of the political economy of democracies during a time of this COVID pandemic. And given the fact that I think some of our readers, some of the audience may not have economics training, or may not have read into political economy, in great length or depth. Perhaps, Martin, you can start by setting the scene and context in terms of what your understanding of political economy is.
Well, there are many answers to this question, and so I'll just sort of give two. Historically, go back to the beginning, the word economics comes from the Greek, as do so many words in the English language, and it refers to the management of the household. And when they added political, they meant, of course, that by that the city-state, the state, which was a community of citizens. And so political economy is the management of the state's household. So it was always seen as intimately connected with the society as an organized political community. And of course, Aristotle, one of the greatest of all Greek philosophers, famously said that human beings, actually used the word for human being, is a political animal, by which he meant human beings are intensely social, and they organize themselves politically. And in his view, the right way to do so was by seeing themselves as citizens. Of course, this referred only to men. Now, that's the technical definition, and that obviously can envelop everything about our life. But I suppose nowadays we would simply think of this as economics in the broader social and political context. So the analysis of the economic life as part of the broader life of the political community.
Great. I'm trying to put on my politician's hat as well as somebody who used to study economics. And we were taught in school, economics is about how economic resources are distributed in a country or in an entity, and politics is about the distribution of power within a society. And when you combine the two, you get a situation where the distribution of power, political power, influences the allocation of economic resources. So that would be sort of like my politician and as well as economic training, economics training kind of way of explaining it to myself, at least. Does that make sense? Something like that?
Yes, that's perfectly correct. I'm writing a book on this at the moment, and I have a whole chapter of the relationship between economic forces and political power. I mean, I would say it's more intimate than that, in that since the human economy is a social creation, it's underpinned by institutions, absolutely essential institutions such as the law, property rights, security, defense, many others, which depend on politics. So there's both a benign relationship between politics and economics. That is to say, our economies couldn't operate outside the framework. That's what I meant at the beginning. But of course, there's a less benign version, which is predatory politics, exploiting the economy for the benefit of a limited few. And that, of course, is historically, if you go back since the development of the city, and agrarian economy, the agrarian economy in the city 8,000 years ago, much of the politics in relationship to the economy has been highly predatory, with huge proportions of the resources being concentrated in very few hands.
Yeah, the feudal state and all that kind of stuff. Can I ask you, can you give us a preview of the title of your book? Or is that a secret?
The working title is The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism.
Okay, yeah. And that's something that you've been speaking about quite passionately over the last, probably last 10 years? Maybe since the
something like that, since the financial crisis, and even more since 2016.
Great. Okay, since we've delved into the area of political economy, I just want to go into the first set of questions. I want to start by asking your comment and your views on how different countries, how different democracies have reacted to this COVID pandemic in terms of how you think the politics of these countries have influenced the extent and the nature of economic shutdowns. Some countries have chosen a path of, a very strict enforcement, like France. I think you still can't dine in Paris, and you can't. There's a curfew at 6 p.m. Whereas there are other countries, some states in the United States, for example, that allow people to go out drinking and partying and stuff like that. So what do you think are some of the forces at play? Let's start off at the national level that differentiate these responses among the different developed economies, developed democracies.
I think this is an utterly fascinating question, and I think we're still trying to learn what shaped these responses. So first of all, it's very striking to us that some of the East Asian and Pacific democracies, countries as different as South Korea, Taiwan, New Zealand, and Australia, to take 4 well-known examples, all democracies, they responded by basically very, very swiftly bringing the virus under control, closing their frontiers, managing quarantining people coming in. But they were so successful so quickly that essentially domestically they managed to live a pretty normal life. So that I regard as the most successful response. And in that respect, these democracies, and Japan was very similar to them, not quite there, behaved rather similarly to the way China did when it got the original outbreak. It eliminated it and then went back more or less to normal life. Why did they do this? Well, obviously, there are many reasons why they did this. And they shared it with other countries like Vietnam, interestingly, with very much not a democracy. Obviously, one of the reasons they'd experienced this before with SARS, and they'd learnt from that, and they'd responded to it. In the West, we had no experience with a disease like this. The last pandemic of this kind really was 100 years ago. The subsequent, so initially nobody took it seriously. And by the time they did take it seriously, it had become too late, because it was everywhere and it became impossible to control. Now, once you got it everywhere, and that happened very quickly, within a month or two, they then have a terrible set of dilemmas. First, ordinary people start staying at home and not going out and not shopping, so the economy collapses anyway. And then when people start dying in large numbers, the hospitals get overflowed. So governments respond by saying, we've got to stop, we've got to get people back. So we've got to get this, and we've got to get the disease, the death under control. We've got to close things down. So then people started thinking about closure. And in addition to all this, we didn't have the equipment to manage it. It was a real disaster in the early months, in the second quarter particularly. So they started closing down to different degrees. Then we began to see some really big cultural differences. As these famously in Europe, Sweden was the country that said, we'll give you some advice, no lockdowns, you behave sensibly. And
we tried to achieve herd immunity.
What?
We tried to achieve herd immunity, yeah.
Yeah, so they tried to achieve herd immunity, and that they basically stuck with that. They've had a higher death rate than other Nordic countries, but their economy has not been so terribly hit. It's also been hit very badly. And you got similar phenomena in America, where some states took that sort of attitude, basically the Republican ones, and the other states, Democrat-led ones, tended to be much more concerned about what was happening, so they locked down. And this is a lot of that. These differences were really dependent on what countries, the people and the politicians were prepared to accept in terms of authoritarian policies. I have been struck, however, by how willing the Western politicians and peoples have been to accept extraordinary controls on their behavior once it became clear how big a crisis it was. But even so, their capacity to implement these controls, the willingness of the people to accept them have varied very considerably. And that's shown itself in death rates, and in the performance of economies.
Martin, what do you attribute to the surprising willingness of many people, especially in the context of developed democracies that are not used to such harsh measures? Why do you think people were willing to accept these kinds of harsh lockdowns?
Most Western democracies are reasonably high trust societies. I think they're not necessarily more so than the most successful East Asian countries, which are also very high trust societies, but they're high trust societies. My own view is if you're not a high trust society, you can't be a developed country. I mean, basically, it's a necessary condition for making very complicated societies and economies work is a fair level of trust. They trust one another, by and large. They're fairly low crime societies, and by and large, they trust governments. Not without limit, and I think there's least trust now in the United States, but by and large, they trust governments. So they started thinking, well, this is like a war. The people tens of thousands of people are dying. This is like a war. In a war, we're used to having our countries mobilized. It's a long time ago since the Second World War, but of course, in the Second World War, the combatants were fully mobilized, and people accepted that. And basically, politicians were able to say, "This is a war. You have to trust us. Your neighbors are dying. You may die. These are the only sensible way. This is the sensible way of dealing with this." Of course, there was some debate, but in fact, in those circumstances, when it's a national emergency of this kind, people are prepared to accept these instructions because they're seen as fair. Everybody has to obey them, and they're seen as necessary.
This one is a little bit of a departure from political economy, but how much do you think an individual leader's personality and sort of like attitude towards the handling of this pandemic would affect how much a country's economic activities are closed down, and also the willingness of people to accept this based on their trust or distrust or mistrust of these leaders? I mean, obviously Donald Trump is an exception; he's an outlier. But you do see some differences. Jacinta Ardern has been held up as somebody who has a high trust and has been successful. And then, of course, in the case of the UK, I think Boris Johnson has a bit more of a mixed record. So how do you think individual leaders' personality and leadership traits come into play?
I think there are two dimensions to that. First, politicians have responded themselves. This is a crisis of politics, crisis of leadership. This is a situation, if it's a war situation, in which you need a leader who will decide, somebody has to decide what to do. As Churchill did famously in Britain during the Second World War. You need a war leader, or Roosevelt in America. Now, some of the politicians turned out to be war leaders. We didn't elect them to be war leaders because we didn't expect a war. Yep. And some of them turned out not to be. What is a war leader? A war leader has to have a clear strategy, has to know what he or she wants, has to have the ability to implement it tactically. So it has to be surrounded by competent advisors whom he or she trusts. and the people have to have confidence in her and them. And that's clearly happened in New Zealand. They had a clear strategy. They had a very good chief medical officer whom the Prime Minister trusted and the people trusted, and they implemented it. I would say in most other countries, it's been a much more mixed story. They did very well in some of the Nordic countries like Denmark and Norway. Mrs. Merkel did very well in the early stages in Germany, and Germany responded relatively well. Elsewhere, they tended to be overwhelmed because either they lacked the leadership. Italy and Spain got hit first. They didn't really know what was hitting them. And Boris Johnson's never been clear what he wanted to do. And it wobbled. It's not that people haven't obeyed. They have largely obeyed what he wanted them to do. So the British are a bit anarchic. But he's changed his mind all the time. It's been a sort of mess, and the government has been incoherent. And of course, in America, it's federal in the first case. So each state has its own rule. And Donald Trump has actually, it was perfectly obvious from the beginning, no interest in or understanding of government. He doesn't want a government. He doesn't care about government. He just wants to be president. He doesn't want to do anything with it. So the quality of leader and the strategic and tactical abilities of the leader are, of course, crucial, as well as the way society responds. And, of course, the nature of society. Britain, for example, like Italy, is a very densely populated, small country, very large cities, many people living in not terribly good conditions, very densely inhabited, particularly by immigrant communities. This is a situation in which the disease can spread like wildfire, particularly to old people. Other countries are very different also in terms of their geography and demography.
Yeah. Let's move on to the second broad set of questions, and this has got to do with the fiscal responses of different democracies around the world. And I think we've observed different kinds of fiscal strategies being used. Some countries have chosen to give cash assistance or injections. For example, the United States, initially gave people, on average, a paycheck that was large enough to actually increase the overall disposable income during the first fiscal injection or the fiscal stimulus. And then other countries such as the UK have used tax credits and wage-related subsidies via employers to cushion the economic blow from the COVID crisis. So with the benefit of hindsight, about a year since some of these policies were implemented, which countries do you think have implemented the most effective or targeted fiscal measures to help those that have been most affected by this COVID pandemic?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. First of all, pretty well every major developed country has spent an awful lot of money. The numbers are very impressive. To give you an example, in the British case, we now expect public debt to rise by 25 percentage points of GDP, but from the beginning to the peak. We haven't spent money like this or borrowed money like this since the Second World War. And that's true of many developed countries. They vary a bit, but most of them have spent an enormous amount of money. As you rightly say, they've spent it in different ways. The biggest difference is whether you support people as people, just give them money, or whether you try to maintain in being the enterprises and their employees. So the idea of, for instance, our furlough scheme, which was like the German short-term work scheme, was to make sure that the companies, there was a lot of direct support for companies, subsidies to companies, which were losing their markets, of course, and the workforce remained attached. And the hope is that as a result, they will come back more quickly. So we don't know yet whether that will prove to be true, because we're not yet, we're beginning the strong recovery. Of course, it's better than the second quarter, but we don't know how quickly this recovery will go. So we don't know whether this will turn out to work. Well, the Americans, of course, rely, as they always have done, on, hire and fire. Usually the American labor market is very flexible, and when the recovery happens, everything will work out fine. So I would say it's too early to tell who will do best in terms of the support. What we do know is that there were very wide differences in the scale of the economic collapse. So some countries closed down less of their economy. They were less brutal in the closure of their economy, which was done for health reasons. So Britain and Spain and Italy suffered declines. You talked about the Malaysian decline. Our declines are close to 10% of GDP. America is close, if I remember, about 3.5%. I'm talking about last year's expected GDP decline. So enormous differences in economic costs, which relate in part to the lockdowns, the severity of the lockdowns, and to these support measures, of course.
Yeah. Traditionally, rating agencies and central banks even have been quite distasteful or quite loath to allow governments to run up huge, budget deficits in short periods of time without significant hits to their rating, to their credit ratings. I think some countries have taken a hit, but governments don't really seem to care at this point in time. They're just going to spend the money. But how long do you think this kind of fiscal, fiscal attitude will continue? Do you think it's something that's short term, just for maybe the next couple of years, or do you think the governments in developed democracies would continue to pump up money as long as they feel that it's needed to revive the economy?
Well, these are really difficult questions. So first of all, what will be necessary? And then the question is, from their point of view, what will they be allowed to get away with?
Yeah.
Obviously, during the crisis, central banks were tremendously supportive. We went into the crisis with very low inflation, in most countries below target inflation in the developed world. So central banks felt completely uninhibited in expanding their balance sheets. They bought an enormous part of the bonds being issued. Interest rates, because of their monetary policies and because of the economic collapse, borrowing collapsed, were very, very low. So in most developed countries, though debt has risen a great deal, debt service by the government is at an extraordinary low. So as long as that's the case, and there's no real fiscal pressure, or there has been no real fiscal pressure. Now, interest rates are beginning to rise now. They're still very, very low. They're not at a worrying level, but that, of course, it's going to make people a little bit more nervous. And at some point, particularly if inflation starts to pick up, which is quite possible, not certain, central banks will start raising interest rates. And then the debt arithmetic is going to look a bit worse, and governments are going to be forced to close their deficits. And indeed, our Chancellor this week, just a couple of days ago, has introduced a budget which will includes tax increases a couple of years from now, which are designed to close the deficit. My guess is, since all these countries have widely used international currencies, they are the two main reserve currencies of the world are the dollar and euro. They're the biggest. They're not going to be really constrained in their ability to finance their deficits and debts at current levels, but they will have to reduce the deficit. I don't expect the debt to be repaid. They hope to grow out of it. Will this end up being very problematic? We don't know. But I like to point out, I really don't know. Really, we don't know. Yeah. In the British case, at the current levels, we expect net debt to peak at a little over 100% of GDP, probably about 105, 110, nobody knows exactly. That actually is below the average of the last 300 years. People forget how much debt historically the British state has borne. So it's not yet, I think, a crisis for the developed countries, because in the end, these are the currencies everybody has to hold, because there isn't really an alternative. The RMB is not an internationally tradable currency in the same way. And certainly I don't consider that the US will have any serious problem in financing itself. maybe there'll be more inflation, a bit like the 70s, but I can't see a world in which the US ceases to be creditworthy.
Okay, well, that's reassuring to know. We wouldn't want to have another economic crisis, resulting from, a run on the currencies.
It's possible. Never say never, but as long as governments behave reasonably sensibly, big question, I think it's avoidable.
Okay, the third broad set of questions I want to throw your way is with regards to assistance to companies. We talked a little bit about assistance to individuals just now. We talked about wage subsidies for companies, but have you seen any interesting indicators or trends between different countries in terms of the kind of industries that governments have chosen to support? So, some countries may perhaps be more supportive of the small and medium enterprises because they are the ones that have probably the lowest cash reserves and probably would be the most hit. But they may also be the ones that are the most flexible to get back on their feet. And on the other hand, you also have large industries that have been large companies in industries that have been decimated. So, for example, airlines, for example. How have you seen sort of like the kind of lobbying pressures on the government by these various industrial groups, whether it's small companies or whether it's these large companies in different sectors, to ask the government to give it more help?
Well, what's happened is most governments, the means, have provided pretty comprehensive assistance to, as far as they can see, to everything. Now, a lot of that has come from the central bank and the commercial banks. So the central banks have all, without exception, pursued these ultra easy monetary policies. They have, in some very important cases, particularly in America, directly bought bonds of companies. It's particularly important because a lot of the intermediation in the United States is not via the banks, as it is in Europe, but via the capital markets. So they bought bonds, they financed companies in this way. And of course, in many countries, including Britain, there's been strong efforts to get the commercial banks to lend and to guarantee some of their lending. That's particularly important for small and medium-sized enterprises. So there's been a comprehensive support program. Of course, nonetheless, lots of businesses have disappeared, and perhaps inevitable, and we hope a lot will come back. But I think the difference between countries has tended to depend on the way businesses is financed. That's been particularly important in explaining the differences the US and the Europeans in the way they've approached it. Now, as you rightly note, there are some particularly vulnerable businesses which have been very, very badly hit, and clearly they have been getting support. The airlines are an important example. They have been given enough support to survive, at least so far. I'm not aware of that. I mean, there's some smaller airlines in Northern Europe that have gone, but the really big carriers have been supported, because the feeling of the governments is this is temporary. There's no reason to let the airlines disappear because we're going to need them again. And so the general policy has been to support them. And one of the things that is pretty surprising to me, is that through these various means, we've actually had remarkably few really big and visible bankruptcies. Most of the big companies of the Western world obviously there are bankruptcies, that's quite normal, but most of the companies of the Western world have actually survived, and largely because of the immensely easy financing conditions, the belief that it's temporary, very important, and the fiscal support.
Martin, you talked about the economic recovery and bounce back that's being experienced in many countries now. What kind of interesting trends have you observed in terms of government putting in policies to reorient industry, reorient the kind of the structure of the underlying structure of the various economies in different countries. Using this as an opportunity to to use President Biden's words, build back better, so to speak, or build back differently.
That's a very, very good question. And I don't claim to be an expert on what everybody has done. But my own impression is, and America may now be an exception, is that so far, really and truly, all the governments have been completely overwhelmed by the crisis. So they talk about building back better, and they talk about, Green New Deals and things like that. That was already there before. But the reality is all their effort and energy has gone into survival, into making sure that the economy will be there when we come back, that people will have jobs. It's far too soon, of course, to launch a huge investment program. It takes time, and a completely new infrastructure or other investment program takes time. And the truth is, nobody really knows yet how different our economy is going to be, as it were, naturally. But are people going to all go back to working in offices 5 days a week or not? Or are many going to continue to stay at home at least part of the time? Because we've just discovered we can work from home. We didn't know that. It was overnight. Every business in the world, or many businesses around the world, suddenly found a completely new way of working. Is that going to be enduring or not? Nobody really knows. What's the future of the real estate business? Is it possible that actually the really big bankruptcies are going to be in real estate businesses? Because are we going to move out of cities? And governments really don't know the answer to this question, and neither do businesses. And so reshaping whole economies when you have such uncertainty is really very, very difficult. So my view is there's rhetoric in this, and I think clearly the Americans are going to use this as an opportunity to build infrastructure, which is terribly lacking anyway. And we are doing more public investment this time than we did after the financial crisis, because our infrastructure is terrible, and everybody knows that. But I think because the shape of the post-crisis economy is in many respects uncertain. Again, what's going to be the future of globalization? Nobody's really sure either. Given that, I think governments are so far playing a fairly cautious game. They are supporting the recovery in general, and they are hoping that the shape will emerge, and as this happens, they will start following it. The really big sort of strategic question they're thinking about is the green revolution, the movement. Is this the opportunity to do an accelerated move towards renewables, recreating our economy around the renewable electric economy? And I think there is very serious discussion of this going on. We've got, of course, a COP in Britain, in Glasgow this summer, the autumn, I think, actually. But again, I'm not aware of any of the big countries. I haven't looked at all the small, who are really, really going to do something enormous. But there's a lot of discussion of it, particularly in the EU, where the rescue program has a very strong orientation in this direction. And that is, I think, the most interesting one. Is this going to be, are we going to build back green? And at the moment, I'm a bit skeptical, but there's an awful lot of discussion of it.
Yeah. Maybe just one last point in this particular section. We talked about building back better, the economy bouncing back. Do you have any sort of thoughts about youth employment or unemployment, moving forward in the recovery period? I mean, the young people are the ones that usually get the worst hit during any economic crisis, and usually they are also the ones who, benefit the least as well when the economy, sort of bounces back. So, any thoughts on youth unemployment given the audience?
Yeah, I think certainly in the countries I know best, the developed countries, in the West, the young people have been very, very badly hit. They've been badly hit if they can't go to university. If they're in university, they hope the people who've just left university, they don't have any jobs. They and of course the unskilled people who didn't go to university, they tended mostly to work in activities. They were waiters, shop assistants, people like this. They've all lost their jobs. A lot of them have ended up as delivery workers, of course, because of the, Amazon and its peers have done so very, very well. But yes, it's very, very clear that the young, the unskilled are among the biggest victims. Also women, particularly women with children who have been forced back into childcare because of the schools disruption.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
That's very, very important. So, I'd say the disease kills the old, but the economy kills the young, as it were. And I think the experience we've had in the past is this is likely to scar these young people for a long time, because as the economy comes back, they will be competing with the people who are just a bit younger than them, who are also looking for jobs. So there'll be more people looking for jobs at the same time than usual, young people, and the economy will be coming back in a form we don't really know. So I'm very concerned about the long run costs for the young. A lot will depend on whether we have a strong, vigorous bounce back in our economies. We return to normal quickly. People are increasingly optimistic that will happen, because the one thing that is going quite well is the vaccine program. Now, this is, of course, subject to the risk there will be new varieties of disease, new variants that won't work, that the vaccines won't protect us against. So far, people are fairly optimistic it will work fairly well and we can keep up. If that works, then maybe the damage will be brief, and above all, much briefer than after the financial crisis. The financial crisis was not as big, but it went on for much longer than this now seems likely to do. And if that were the case, if that is the case, because once the disease is over, we can go back to normal, then I'm optimistic that the young will not come out of it too well. But they will be badly affected. There's no doubt they have been, and that will last.
Yeah. Well, since you talked about the one positive thing, which is the rollout of vaccines, we've seen different sort of like rates of success in terms of vaccine rollout in different democracies. Of course, Israel seems to be a country that's being held up as a good example. But at the same time, we see countries that traditionally have had good public healthcare systems, including France and Germany, suffering from hiccups in terms of the rollout of the vaccine. What kind of success factors do you attribute some countries doing better than others in rolling out the vaccine?
It's very interesting. I mean, another country which I just reading about, which has been very, very slow, is Japan, which is also historically a pretty efficient country.
Yeah.
And of course, they've had a relatively low incidence of the disease, so they might not have thought it was such an emergency. Now, it's pretty clear in retrospect that one of the things the Trump administration got right was probably the thing they got right was the massive investment in vaccines, what they, I think, called Operation Warp Speed. And of course, the United States has, there's no doubt, is the world's leader in these technologies. It has the world's biggest drugs companies. So when they put all their resources into this, the NIH is the world's leading funder of health research. And when they put all their money into this, a hell of a lot happens, and a hell of a lot did. So the Americans even funded the German vaccine. I mean, they funded everything. And
so did Dolly Parton, I hear.
Yes, so did Dolly Parton. Yeah, exactly true. Yes, she did indeed. And of course, Britain has historically had, this is one of the sectors in which Britain is historically relatively strong. There's a strong life sciences tradition. I mean, the life sciences are an area in which the Western world remains relatively developed compared with digital technologies. So Britain also, and it was a big crisis because the disease was everywhere. I mean, having a disease everywhere really motivates you to go for vaccines. If you've got the disease well under control, it's less of a priority, isn't it? So I think part of the reason they did this is they were terrified. They had the scientific capacity, which say Spain and Italy didn't, in these countries, and they were terrified. So they put a lot of effort into it. The Germans linked up. They got support from the German government, also the American government. But there's a very strong scientific base in Germany. So if we look at the Western world, it's a combination of the scientific base, in the country, or countries, the motivation of the politicians, which had a lot to do with how much of the disease they had around and how quick they were to organize it. Now, in the EU, finally, there was a very special problem, which is they handed this over because they didn't want a race among the EU countries, because they feared if they did, the big countries would get everything, the small countries would be left behind. This would look very bad to Europe. So they handed it over to the Commission, and the Commission was pretty sloppy. And the truth is that the Commission had no experience in this. They'd never been asked to handle a major health crisis because that was not part of their competence. And the commissioner they had in charge really was never chosen to deal with a world-class emergency like this. So I actually think the Commission has learned a lot, and it won't make this mess again. But if you ask an intergovernmental bureaucracy to do something it's never done before, when it has no real expertise and has no knowledge of this, low real confidence in its own capacity, you're going to get hiccups. And they've got some very, very big hiccups. And then they started getting panicky and made some very, very silly decisions, particularly in relationship to Britain and Ireland. So that became a mess. Am I surprised? Not really. I mean, the basic point is at each stage of this, governments have done well or badly. And the fact that you did well last time doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to do well in the next challenge. It's an endless series of challenges. It's like one of those video games, isn't it? And in a video game, you might win one day, the next time you get killed. And I think that's what's happening. It's a multi-stage video game that we're watching.
Yeah, I'm going to pick one of the questions in the Q&A and adjust it a bit. The question is asking, what is the role of media in the political economy? I'll adjust that a little bit. I'll change it a bit, and to say that, what do you think has the media's sort of like editorial policy been in terms of, especially in Western Europe, in terms of covering the news about the efficacy of the vaccines coming from China as well as from Russia, right? Is there some sort of inherent bias, inbuilt bias, to say that, look, Pfizer, the vaccines coming from Europe are of higher quality, are better, transparency in data, and those that are coming from perhaps China and Russia have lower efficacy, or has there been any of that kind of political economy kind of differentiation in media coverage?
I don't think this is really about the media. I mean, obviously, countries in a crisis like this tend to become more nationalistic. Politicians become more nationalistic. This is one of the problems, because you've got a global crisis and we all become more nationalist. I think it's making it more difficult to manage the crisis. I've written a lot about this. But I think and of course there is undoubtedly a competition element with Russia and China, which are now seen increasingly in the West as hostile countries. Russia's been seen as hostile now for quite a long time. It goes back really to the Crimean episode, but even before that, and China more recently. There's no doubt about that. That's the background. And in that light, people write about them in that way now. But there's a more specific thing that, each country has its own regulators. and they do their own tests and looking at the evidence. And until very recently, I think it's changing. I'm not absolutely sure. The view in the West was we don't have evidence on these vaccines. I mean, this is not just discriminating against Russia or China. Until relatively recently, we had the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which was approved in Britain. They had some problems with their trials, and it wasn't approved in America or Europe. So that wasn't about Russia or China. It was, they just weren't approved because the regulators said these people haven't produced the necessary evidence. And it's only very recently that AstraZeneca has been approved in America and Europe. Now, the same thing applies with Russia and China. They need to produce evidence. And that will happen, I think. But governments are terrified of the possibility that they will put, quite rightly in my view, that they will inject tens of millions of people with something which turns out to damage them. And that would be, we have had terrible medical catastrophes in the past. So I think it was essentially, I mean, of course, there's a geopolitics and there's a suspicion, but essentially, we didn't feel, our regulators didn't feel they had confidence in these vaccines, and they needed the evidence, the data, and so forth. And if they work, they will end up being approved. I am quite clear. National regulators will approve them. It looks as though Hungary will do so, and then the media will follow in line.
One question is, is pointing to this age-old debate about the handling of the COVID crisis in democracies versus non-democracies. So, traditionally you could point to, China being a non-democratic country, having handled this COVID crisis somewhat better compared to a large democracy like India. So, what is your response towards that argument to say that, non-democratic countries can clamp down on their citizens faster, stronger? They don't really care about votes. So places like China can lock down cities and regions for a long time. Hence, that is the kind of power that we need to be used in countries, including in developed democracies, in order to fight this crisis. What would you say to that?
Yeah, what has interested me actually is the opposite. When I look at this, what is interesting is that there have been democracies that have handled it very, very well. And there have been some autocracies that have handled it very, very well. So, Korea and Taiwan and New Zealand and Australia, who I've already mentioned, did it very well. Japan did it pretty well. China did it well. Vietnam did it remarkably. And then there have been democracies which have been sort of overwhelmed by it in Europe, North America, and India is obviously a very important example. And then there are autocracies where I think we really don't know what happened because the data aren't clear. And that's obviously part of the problem. There are lots of places where we really don't know what happened. But what seems to me clear is that, as I said earlier, the competence of the government, its ability to mobilize the people, and the trust people have in it seems to be more important than the type of political regime. So we've actually had very effective autocracies and very effective democracies, and the inverse. The second aspect, I mean, there are semi-democracies or disorganized semi-democracies in South America that have done very, very badly. And that, I think, has a lot to do with these being low trust, ineffective governmental systems. And that would be true if they had autocracies as they used to, or if they've been democracies. Mexico is a sort of semi-autocracy. It's difficult to define what it is. It's a disaster. Brazil, too. It's a semi-autocracy under Bolsonaro, but with a populist leader. So I don't think the democracy versus autocracy thing quite works. What is interesting is obviously huge differences in ability to cope and to respond in many dimensions between developed and developing countries. And in this respect, China is quite developed. It can organize itself. India can't. I never thought that a lockdown was a feasible policy in India. It's too big. It's too populous. It's still too undeveloped for everybody to. You cannot keep everybody at home in India, because if you try to, they'll starve. So a lockdown is completely unworkable. This is also relevant to Africa, it doesn't make sense because most of the population is young. They're not going to die of it anyway. India has very few people over 80, so it doesn't matter. So the level of development is crucial because it affects demography and your ability to close down the economy and your ability to support a closed down economy. So that means that's nothing to do with politics, strictly speaking. It's to do with levels of development. And the appropriate policy for a country really does depend on these aspects of its economic development more than its political system.
Yeah. Okay. Going back to the fiscal issue, I think we're almost running out of time. I was having a discussion with a friend this morning, and this question popped out again. What is your view of policies revolving around the mass printing of money to save the economy? This is the modern monetary theory, which has come back again in vogue, primarily as a response to the pressures for the government to spend more. Do you think it's time to try out this modern monetary theory, or do you think it's a lot of hogwash?
Well, my view, it's neither. My answer is neither. The money printing that has occurred was more or less inevitable in this crisis. In an extreme crisis, the central bank has to support the government. There are risks. I didn't think the risks were enormous as long as it's contained and stops at some point. So this is fairly orthodox. It's not some new theory. During the Second World War, the Bank of England supported the government wholesale. Will this in the end lead to inflation? I think it's perfectly possible that it will. It depends on what they do now, but it could lead to some inflation, and we'd have to accept that consequence if it does happen. Now, MMT is a bolder claim, which is that in normal times, governments don't need to borrow at all. They can just finance themselves by the printing press. And as long as there is slack in the economy, as they measure it, they can just go on doing that. I think that's wrong. I think that's almost bound to lead in the long run to explosive inflations. Because politicians, if they are told, they don't need to worry about borrowing. They can just borrow from the central bank. As long as there's slack in the economy, they're going to say, well, there's always some slack in the economy. Nobody knows how much slack there is in the economy, and nobody knows how much money people are going to be prepared to hold. But, and in this situation, it's almost as we've seen this happen hundreds of times in world history. They're going to overdo it. They're going to overprint. They're going to start to generate inflation. That will start leading to a flight from money. There'll be a huge money base. Money supply will be excessive. This will then start generating an overshooting of inflation and a major inflationary upsurge. So I think that this is a very dangerous view of normal policy. In normal times, I don't think this makes sense. But in abnormal times, you have to do abnormal things.
Okay, maybe one last question on my part. We talked briefly, before the interview started formally about the amazing technological transformations that have happened over the past 10 years that have allowed many of the work from home and Zoom meetings and whatnot. Do you want to comment a little bit on that to sort of like say what the trajectory moving forward will be in terms of technological transformations and how they would affect the nature of work post-COVID?
And the economy. I think that's perhaps the most fascinating aspect. It's clear that 10 years ago we could not have done what we did. And we were surprised, we were shocked that it was possible. I remember very, very well, we all went home from the FT in March, early March, and it's as if nothing had happened. Nobody, we went on, we were producing a daily product and it didn't change anything. Now, I can promise you, when I first went to the paper 30 years ago, these would have been unimaginable technology in every way. We couldn't have printed like this. It would have been impossible. So that's a revolution, a real revolution. And what I think it's done, the revolution was coming, but it's accelerated its adaptation. The adaptation and use of it, use of the technology has been accelerated by 5 years, 10 years, I don't know, but something enormous. What does it mean for the future? Well, it's part of an ongoing revolution. AI, which we have, isn't part of this, which is part of this. And I think it has perhaps at least two colossal dimensions. First, how do we live and work where we are? And secondly, it is opening, obviously, the possibility for a new form of globalization, what I call virtual globalization. If you can do this with the FT, well, we're a very small enterprise, but we're a worldwide enterprise. We produce 24/7, as it were. We have workers in America, everywhere, Asia, Philippines is one of our big hubs, China. We can operate globally, and we can put our people anywhere in the world. So I think this is going to create a new form of globalization, virtual globalization, in which we're all doing jobs we can be doing jobs in the same business. We're just located not just in different cities in our own country, but in different cities all across the world. And this will transform our societies and lives, the interactions we're now having similarly, in ways that we can't foresee. So I think we're moving from the supply chain globalization of the 1980 to 2007 period or so, these massive supply chain globalization, which may go into reverse to some degree for security reasons, into this new virtual globalization. And the interesting thing is the country that is in many ways most suspicious of that is, of course, China, because it's got this firewall around the internet. But I think this is going to create some fascinating changes, and particularly for countries like India or yours, where many, many people speak English perfectly, this will open up a whole new range of opportunities.
So on that positive note, we want to thank Martin for the very interesting views that he has shared. And I'm glad that I managed to escape relatively unscathed. He did not scream or shout at me for asking stupid questions. So thank you very much, Martin. And I also like to,
I wouldn't do that.
I also like to thank the organizers for allowing us to have this wonderful conversation. And I hope that each and every one of you would have learned something, and I'm confident that you would have. So keep your ears plugged to news, and also to your brain activity tuned in to all the new developments that's happening around the world because of this COVID crisis. And hopefully you can make better sense of it by reading good quality news reporting like that is coming out from the Financial Times. So thank you very much, Martin, and keep safe. Have you had your vaccine already? Can I ask?
I've had my first shot. Second shot in a month.
Okay.
Bye.
Great.
Thank you very much.
See you. Bye-bye.